The Esperitas took them in swift silence, their masked figures moving with cold efficiency as the crows were bound, disarmed, and dragged into their carriages. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, the residual crackle of electroplasm still hanging between them like an unspoken threat. Jack clenched his jaw, his mind already working through possible escape routes, but Rabbit Foot gave him a single look, a look that said, "Trust me." For days, the Esperitas interrogated them. They were thorough, methodical, but the crows had faced worse. Jack endured in silence, giving only smirks and half-truths when pressed. Harry, though shaken, quickly learned the game, deflecting with half-answers and innocent shrugs. But it was Rabbit who played his role best. He didn't resist. He let them think he was just another gambler who had gotten in too deep, just another fool swept up in things beyond his control. And then, when the time was right, he made his move. With a single phone call, Rabbit set the gears of their release into motion. Cosine, the politician he and Harry had cultivated as an ally, worked his magic. It took a few days, but by the time the crows were escorted out of their cells, they weren't just free men, they were ghosts. Their records erased, their involvement in the attack rewritten to paint Merrick Ishtar as the villain. The city was in chaos, a political scandal of unprecedented scale, and the crows were walking away clean. By the time they made it back to their hideout, the weight of their escape still clung to them. Harlequina had been waiting. She had seen them taken, but she hadn't let herself be caught. Trusting Rabbit was one thing, but she wasn't the type to let herself get locked up when she could do something about it. She had spent the past few days planning their jailbreak, only for them to stroll through the door as if nothing had happened. She was pleased, of course, but she didn't say it outright. Instead, as they settled in, she let them tell their sides of the story. Jack leaned against the table, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the last remnants of his imprisonment. "So," he said, his voice dry, "should I even ask how you pulled that off, Rabbit?" Rabbit smirked, stretching out on the old couch. "You know me. Always have an ace up my sleeve." Harry let out a breath, rubbing his temples. "I don't know about you guys, but I need about a week of sleep before I do anything else." Harlequina snorted. "You say that, but we both know you're going to spend the next 2 hours pacing before passing out at your desk." Harry opened his mouth to protest but stopped when they all heard it. A sound at the gate. Harlequina's trained hound was the first to react, barking furiously, its body low and tense. The cat that had been living in their hideout darted for cover, its back arched in alarm. That was a bad sign. Harry froze. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked quietly. Harlequina shook her head. No, a bad feeling settled over the group. Harlequina moved without hesitation, slipping into the kitchen as she sent her hound outside, her vision shifting to its eyes. Harry, moving quickly but quietly, made his way upstairs to get a better look from the window. Rabbit and Jack stayed by the door. The figure at the gate was already making his way into the garden, moving with a strange, easy confidence, completely unbothered by the dog barking at his heels. The hound snapped at him, but he never even flinched. Jack took a slow step forward, his hand hovering near his knife. Then Rabbit got a good look at him. Tall and lean, his piercing green eyes gleamed with manic intensity, a smirk dancing across his lips as if he were savoring some private joke. His red hair was wild and unkempt, barely contained beneath the shadows of the dim lantern light. He walked around the snarling hound with ease, his boots crunching softly against the gravel as he stepped toward the house. Jack narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell?" And then Rabbit whispered, barely audible, "Valeska." Jack had barely closed the door before he heard the first chuckle. It was light, casual. Like the sound an old friend might make when greeting someone they hadn't seen in years. But there was something off about it. Something wrong. Jerome Valeska grinned, his green eyes glittering with something Jack couldn't quite place. He held up a small gift bag, waggling it slightly before handing it over. Jack hesitated but took it, peering inside. A wine bottle. Jack frowned. Every part of him screamed that this was a game, a joke. A performance where he was the audience and Jerome was the star. So, Jerome said, spreading his arms as if inviting an embrace. "Won't you let an old friend inside?" Jack tightened his grip on the bag. No was the obvious answer. He forced a casual stance, nodding toward the garden. "Why don't we talk out here?" Jerome let out a sharp laugh, tilting his head like an amused bird. "Oh, Jackie boy, don't be rude. I came all this way just to see you." His voice dipped into something sweet, saccharine. "Let's be hospitable." And then he moved. Not fast. Not aggressive. But with the simple, confident ease of a man who had already decided the outcome of this conversation. He stepped forward, heading straight for the door. Jack's instinct screamed. He moved before thinking, reaching into his pocket and yanking out a small, thin cloth, its fibers soaked in trance powder, a knockout agent strong enough to drop a man in seconds. He lunged, slamming it over Jerome's face just as Harlequina's hound struck from the side, sinking its teeth into Jerome's leg with a vicious snarl. But the expected struggle never came. Instead, Jerome stood there, unmoving. His grin remained untouched, unwavering. The dog's jaws tightened around his calf, but no blood spilled, no flesh tore, only something wrong. Jack's hand, pressed firm against Jerome's face, felt it first. Wet. Cold. Gritty. A sensation that was entirely unnatural. Jack recoiled, yanking his hand back, and his stomach twisted. His fingers were covered in something thick, like wet sand mixed with old, decayed muck. The texture clung to his skin, soaking into the creases of his palm. Jerome didn't flinch. No, he shifted. His skin rippled, his flesh melting into something grotesque, something inhuman. The place where Jack had touched his face distorted, reshaping into an obscene imitation of flesh before sloughing away like mud dripping from a crumbling wall. His smirk widened as his eyes sank slightly, turning into hollow pits of darkness, his whole form convulsing and stretching. His clothes dissolved into the morphing sludge of his body, his limbs lengthening unnaturally. His fingers, once normal, became dripping tendrils of clay, twitching like living things. Jack stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. Jerome Valeska wasn't here. Clayface was. With a sickening, gurgling sound, the thing lunged. Jack barely had time to react before one of Clayface's grotesque, dripping arms struck him, slamming into his chest with a force that knocked the air from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, his back smacking against the dirt. Clayface surged forward, his body folding over itself in ways no human should move, his massive form collapsing like a wave. A thick, heavy hand formed from the rolling sludge, wrapping around Jack's throat and pressing down. The weight was suffocating. The stench. Damp earth, rotting wood, and something old, flooded Jack's nose as his vision blurred. He clawed at the fingers strangling him, but they weren't fingers anymore. They were clay, reshaping, thickening, sealing around his neck like a living vice. Inside the house, Rabbit heard the first thump against the door. Then another. The wood groaned under the impact. He stepped forward, brow furrowing, just as a sickening squelch echoed through the air. His stomach twisted as he saw it. Dark, oozing clay seeping through the cracks in the door, slipping through the gaps in the wood, curling like tendrils searching for something alive. Jack was outside. And he was about to die. Rabbit struggled against the door, but the clay held it fast, sealing the wood shut like an organic lock. He could hear Jack choking outside, the desperate gasps of a man being smothered alive. Panic surged in his chest. The stories of a monster made of clay had always seemed like exaggerations, urban myths whispered between thieves and killers in Doskvol's underbelly. But now, those stories had weight, suffocating, crushing weight. Rabbit slammed his fist against the door. Enough. Let him go and come inside. We have business to attend to. For a moment, silence. Then, as if responding to his command, the door exploded inward. A wave of clay surged through the opening, reforming, shifting, reshaping. It climbed and twisted, molding into something solid, something terrifyingly human. Within seconds, Jerome Valeska stood in the wreckage of the doorway, smoothing out the creases in his coat as if he had simply stepped over the threshold like a polite guest. Jack dropped onto the ground outside, gasping for air, coughing up flecks of clay from his throat. Beside him lay a small, mud-streaked package, whatever Jerome had been carrying before the attack. Jerome turned his attention to Rabbit, his manic grin unwavering. "Unfortunate," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "I hadn't planned on revealing myself this early." Rabbit, still catching his breath, narrowed his eyes. "So, was it always you?" Jerome tilted his head, the grin widening before his body began to shift once again. His features melted, twisted, and in an instant, Rabbit found himself staring into his own face. Clayface now stood before him as a perfect replica, the only difference being the unnatural way he grinned, too wide, too wrong. Harlequina and Harry had rushed to Jack's side by now, helping him sit upright. Harry looked toward the doorway in horror, still shaken from the encounter. Rabbit exhaled, knowing they had no choice. "All right," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "Let's talk." Clayface molded himself back into Jerome as he stepped into the office, settling into a chair like a man without a care in the world. His sadistic smirk never faltered as he folded his hands on the table. "You guys are very interesting," he said. "But you're starting to annoy us." Rabbit sat across from him, his hands clasped together to keep them from twitching. Harlequina entered the room behind him, her body tense, ready to strike if needed. Rabbit leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Jerome's green eyes glittered. "I've been getting your little messages," he said, his voice lilting, almost musical. "Every single one of my men who gets attacked is left with your pretty little calling card." Rabbit didn't flinch. "I was hoping to get to talk to you." It seemed to have worked. Jerome burst into laughter, slapping his knee. "Yes, indeed. I do love a man with initiative." Then, without breaking his manic grin, he continued, "That's why I came to leave an invitation of my own." Harlequina stiffened. "What kind of invitation?" she asked, her voice betraying the faintest trace of fear. Jerome's entire body twitched. Then, in a grotesque display, he became Harlequina, down to her clothes, her scars, even the faint nervous tick she had when she was uneasy. Mimicking her exact tone, he repeated mockingly, "What kind of invitation?" The illusion shattered as he snapped back into his usual form, giggling like a delighted child. "I have something interesting planned," he continued. "And I want the crows there." Rabbit didn't let his expression change. "Why would we attend?" Jerome only chuckled. "Why don't you open your gift and find out?" Jack, still sitting outside, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before reaching for the package Jerome had dropped during the struggle. His fingers hesitated as he undid the binding, pulling back the layers of damp paper. Inside was an hourglass. But instead of sand, a strange purple gas flowed within, unnatural, weightless. It didn't fall downward as one would expect, but instead, rose, moving against gravity to measure time. Next to it, a single playing card. The Joker card. But it wasn't ordinary. 3 balloons had been hand-drawn onto it in rough pencil, and at the bottom, a crude, childlike sketch of a dead crow. Jack's blood ran cold. Harry, peering over his shoulder, felt his breath hitch as his eyes locked onto the swirling purple gas. His voice came out in a whisper, barely able to contain the horror in his tone. "Jack." He swallowed. "That's Ladher." Jerome stood up, stretching his arms as if he had just finished a pleasant conversation over tea rather than delivering a veiled threat drenched in horror. With a cheerful grin, he dusted himself off and clasped his hands together. Well, he said, voice lilting with delight, I believe my work here is done. I do so hope to see you all at the next balloon race above Doskvol. Rabbit's expression remained unreadable, though his mind raced. Who's organizing it? He asked carefully. Jerome turned at the doorway, the light from outside casting his sharp features in an eerie silhouette. He gave an exaggerated bow, his eyes gleaming with something unhinged. Why, none other than our dear Oswald Cobblepot. And just like that, he stepped outside as if nothing had happened. His boots clicked against the wooden porch, his stride light and casual, as though he had simply dropped by to deliver a dinner invitation. Whistling a cheerful tune, he walked out of the crow's hideout and into the streets of Doskvol, disappearing into the mist. Inside, the crows were left frozen, locked in a stunned silence that felt suffocating. None of them spoke, but the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. This was very bad. Clayface, if that's what he was, must be a close ally to Jerome. And if this was the kind of ally Jerome had at his disposal, then he was more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. He wasn't just a threat to the crows, he was a cataclysm waiting to happen. The entire city of Doskvol was in danger. Jack, still leaning against the doorway, clutching his ribs and trying to steady his breath, felt his pulse slow, just a little. Then something caught his eye. Upstairs. A window on the second floor. Open. His breath hitched. That window had been closed before. He was sure of it. His stomach twisted. Rabbit, Jack said, barely able to keep the dread out of his voice. Upstairs. Rabbit and Harry exchanged a glance before bolting up the stairs two at a time. Harlequina lingered near the door, her hand gripping her dagger, still trying to process what had just happened. The room they burst into was where Cross Dava had been staying. The window was wide open. The cold air swept through the room, rattling loose papers and making the candlelight flicker. And in the center of it, Dava stood motionless. Something was wrong. His eyes, rolled all the way back into his head, stared blankly at the ceiling. His body trembled, barely holding itself up. His lips moved, whispering something, repeating it over and over like a broken record. Late, late, he muttered, his voice barely a breath. Says the White Rabbit. Late, late, says the White Rabbit. Rabbit's blood turned to ice. He had heard this before. Harry swallowed hard, stepping cautiously forward. Shit, he whispered, glancing at Rabbit. This is the same as the attack on Tobias's hotel. They had seen people like this before, hypnotized, controlled. The attackers who had stormed Tobias's hotel the previous week had been just like this, lost in their own minds, puppets bound by unseen strings. But who had gotten to Dava? Rabbit's instincts screamed at him to act, and it was a good thing they did. In a sudden, jerking motion, Dava lunged for the desk. His fingers curled around a knife. Dava, no. Rabbit and Harry both reacted in an instant. Rabbit grabbed Dava's arm, twisting it away before he could drive the blade into his own throat. Harry grabbed him around the waist, forcing him down onto the floor. The ex-governor thrashed violently, screaming that eerie, repetitive phrase, his voice raw, inhuman. It took both of them working together to pin him down and bind his wrists with rope. Even then, he writhed against his restraints like a fish caught in a net, his lips still murmuring. Late, late, says the White Rabbit. A shiver ran through Rabbit's spine. The crows were in grave danger from now on. There was no denying it. Jerome hadn't just paid them a visit, he had infected them with his madness. And if whoever had taken control of Dava was working with him, then the game had just changed. And not in their favor.